It's Valentine's Day. You invite someone over to share a meal and be your date on this special night. But once you let them inside, you find out that they have other plans. Sinister ones. This is what happened to a girl named Jodine, and this is her story. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and if you've never been here before, my name is Kimbyrleigha. Nice to finally meet you. Today, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. This is part of my holiday homicide series where I talk about cases that unfortunately happened during holidays. This is another case that happened on Valentine's Day. As you can probably tell, this story is shorter than usual. That's because I've been telling you I do want to share stories that don't have enough information to make them into a deep dive, but that I still find interesting and worthy of being told to you. Now let me introduce you to Jodine Serrin. On November 28, 1967, Art and Lois Serrin gave birth to their daughter, Jodine Elizabeth Serrin. When Jodine was just a child, her parents moved from Glendale, California to Walton Hills, Ohio, where they raised Jodine. She graduated from Bedford High School in 1986. Halle Berry, I'm sure you've heard the name before. She also graduated from Bedford High School 2 years before Jodine. Jodine was one of 6 children, and she had a very close relationship with her family, especially her sisters. After relocating their family back to California, Art and Lois Serrin settled in Carlsbad, and as a child, Jodine developed an affinity for horses, and she took that passion to the Golden State when she moved there from Ohio. She competed in county fairs, and she had a gorgeous horse named Sam that she rode in the Memorial Day Parade every year in Bedford, Ohio. Now that she was in Carlsbad, her horseback riding continued, but not only that. Besides horses, Jodine loved cats, especially her beloved kitten named Angel. After returning to Carlsbad, Jodine earned a degree in floral arrangements. I thought this was really interesting. I have a friend that does this as well, and this really is a talent. I could hardly put together this little bouquet of fake flowers here. Floral arrangements were a hobby that she enjoyed, and she thought it would be good to expand on it and make it into a career. She also loved to keep active. That was essential for Jodine. She loved kayaking, biking, ice skating, and taking long walks on the beach. That was one of Jodine's favorite pastimes. She enjoyed these peaceful moments and the serene atmosphere of Carlsbad. Though Jodine was what they call high functioning, she was diagnosed with learning disabilities and schizophrenia growing up. An individual with high functioning schizophrenia can still experience symptoms. However, unlike someone suffering from the illness being debilitating, she was able to work, go to school, and contribute to family life in a more significant way than other forms of schizophrenia. With the right treatment plan, the illness can be managed. I like to dispel those misconceptions because sometimes when we hear that someone has something like schizophrenia, we immediately think there's something wrong with them. People are all born different, and I think it's important to keep an open mind about individuals and what they are going through. Even with Jodine's diagnosis, she was an inspiring example to others of how a person with this mental condition could still have a productive, loving, and happy life despite their struggles. Jodine had a very active social life as well. She was a member of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. This organization promotes advocacy, education, support, and public awareness for those with mental illness and their families. They make sure to use non-discriminatory approaches and provide equal opportunities for employment, participant and advancement in their programs and their workplaces. They envision a world where all people with any type of mental illness can live a healthy, fulfilling life in a supportive, caring community. Jodine was also a frequent visitor to the Mariposa Clubhouse in Oceanside, California. They offer treatment for individuals with mental health concerns and those with co-occurring substance use disorders. And through her involvement in various organizations, Jodine made many friends. Jodine was described as a sweet, low-key girl, and she was well known among her friends and relatives for her letter and poem writing. Her poems could range from deep and heartfelt to short and sweet, such as Roses Are Red, Violets Are Blue, I Want You to Know, God Is With You. Art and Lois gave Jodine the freedom and independence to be herself. She actually lived alone in a condo on the 1900 block of Swallow Lane in Carlsbad. It was wonderful that Jodine was able to live by herself. And she always kept her apartment very neat and clean, but she still had to rely on her parents for certain things like driving to appointments. Because Jodine did depend on her parents so much to get around, Art and Lois kept in touch with her constantly. It was Valentine's Day 2007, and Art and Lois Serrin decided to go on a date. They wanted to have a little romantic dinner and a movie, and while Lois was enjoying the evening with her husband, she began to feel this nagging feeling inside that something was wrong with Jodine. Lois hadn't spoken to Jodine since the night before, which was extremely unusual. The mother and daughter usually talked to each other several times a day. Before driving home, Art and Lois wanted to stop by Jodine's condo and check on her after the movie that they were watching, which ended around 10 o'clock p.m. When Jodine's parents got there, they knocked on the door a number of times, but no one answered. They tried calling her, and the call was sent directly to voicemail. Now, Jodine's parents, they always tried their best to give her her independence, but they did have a spare key to her condo in case of an emergency. After growing increasingly worried, they decided to try to open Jodine's front door with their key, but they noticed that the chain lock was in place. This is when a sense of dread gripped Art and Lois. When they were looking at that chain latch, they knew that someone had locked the door from the inside and they were not going to be able to get in. All parents worry about their children, even their adult children, but when you have a child in the situation that Jodine was in, you can become even more concerned. So Art decided to break the door down. They were extremely concerned, and upon entering Jodine's condo, Art and Lois noticed that all the lights were on. Everything seemed completely normal. They assumed that Jodine was either taking a shower or she was asleep, so they made their way to her bedroom to see if she was there. When Art opened Jodine's bedroom door, he got a shock. He wasn't expecting to see what he saw. He saw a man clearly in the middle of a sexual act, and he was embarrassed. This father had just witnessed his 39-year-old daughter engaging in a sexual act with someone on Valentine's Day. So he tried to shield his eyes, and he told them to get dressed, and he waited outside the bedroom for them. After Art closed Jodine's bedroom door, he took Lois to a different part of the condo. He didn't want her to be embarrassed even more by her mother seeing what was going on and put them in another compromising position. Jodine's parents waited for about 5 minutes for her and the man to come out of the bedroom, but no one ever did. That's when they decided to walk towards her bedroom door again, and they knocked on it, but for some reason, no one was answering. That's when Jodine's parents decided to open the bedroom door again. They were not prepared for what they were about to discover. The first thing that Art and Lois saw was Jodine still laying in bed, and the man, whoever he was nowhere to be found. However, as Art got closer to Jodine, he realized she was too still, and that's when he decided to reach out and touch her, and she was as cold as ice. And that's when Jodine's parents noticed that there was blood covering every surface in the room. They obviously were shocked. They did not know what was going on, and they immediately called 911. That's when the emergency dispatcher directed Art to perform CPR on his daughter. She ordered him to move Jodine from the bed to the floor, but despite his tireless efforts, he was unable to save his daughter. Jodine was dead. This poor family, thinking that their daughter was asleep or thinking that she was in there with a boyfriend or someone on Valentine's Day that loved her, but to find out that she was dead and that something else was going on, I can't possibly imagine what it would have felt like. An autopsy determined that Jodine was killed by blunt force trauma. But here's the thing. She had been dead for over 10 hours by the time her parents discovered her. That meant that what Jodine's father saw was not an intimate, consensual act. Not at all. Carlsbad police officers arrived at Jodine's apartment on Swallow Lane and found her bedroom in disarray. As I mentioned, there was blood all over it. Jodine's sheets, the walls, the bedroom, the bathroom, everything was covered in blood. They also noticed her bedroom window was covered with a towel or a pillowcase, which indicated that the killer wanted privacy for his heinous acts. The Carlsbad police officers were the most disturbed by the position of Jodine's full-length mirror in her bedroom. It was obvious that whoever did this to her had moved this mirror. It wasn't in the place it usually was. And he moved it and positioned it so that he could watch himself while he was doing what he did. There's no question that Jodine's killer spent a lot of time in her bedroom. He was methodical, cold, and calculating. The officers presumed that Jodine's murderer had escaped through either the bedroom window or he had slipped past Jodine's parents while they were waiting outside for her to come out of the bedroom. At first, the investigators thought that the person must have come through the bedroom window. However, they changed their minds because they discovered something: a pair of men's tennis shoes near the front door. Anyone familiar with Jodine knew that she was very particular about the way that she kept her condo. She was very clean and tidy. She was proud of her home, and every time someone came in, she told them to remove their shoes. She would tell them to please leave their shoes at the front door. The officers started to suspect that Jodine must have known her killer, or at the very least, was willing to let them into her home because of the location of these unknown shoes. And nothing seemed to be out of place, suggesting robbery was not the motive. Carlsbad police officers assumed Jodi's killer walked around her bedroom after doing what he did because there was so much blood everywhere. Crime scene investigators arrived on the scene and began to examine the entire bedroom for evidence. An investigator photographed Jodine's room and discovered a bloody footprint on her carpet. There were fingerprints on the bed sheets and blood, and an unidentified male's DNA on her body in the form of ejaculatory fluid. They put the DNA into CODIS, and they wanted to compare it with convicted felons, but it did not match any suspects. Although the investigators did not find a match in the CODIS database, that didn't mean the killer hadn't committed a crime. It could just mean that the crime that was committed he was never convicted for, or that the arrest occurred before CODIS was established. Nevertheless, the investigators in Jodine Serrin's case had hope. All they needed to do was find the match to the DNA profile to identify their suspect. They thought this was going to be easy. Jodine's friends and family honored her life at St. Patrick's Church in Carlsbad on February 22, 2007. Then her immediate family gathered at San Luis Rey Mission Cemetery after her funeral to lay her to rest. Carlsbad police officers addressed the media and explained that this was not a case of a stranger attacking someone. They said she was targeted, and it was likely that Jodine knew who her killer was. Carlsbad residents were not accustomed to hearing about a violent crime, not like this one. Jodine's murder occurring in a neighborhood like this was very uncommon. But as Carlsbad's second homicide that year, Jodine's murder sent shockwaves throughout the town. It's known to be one of the safest areas to live in California. According to Fox 5 San Diego, violent crime occurred in 191 out of 100,000 residents in Carlsbad. The San Diego Medical Examiner's Office determined that Jodine was killed by blunt force trauma, followed by strangulation. Externally, Jodine had a lot of bruises and scars, evidence of her struggle for life. In addition to that evidence that Jodine had been severely beaten, the medical examiner discovered slashes throughout her body that looked as though they were inflicted after she had been incapacitated. Her family wanted to know who would do something like this. She had to have known who this was, or at least let them inside because she trusted them. The fact that they had continued to hurt her after she was already gone, it just made this even more heartbreaking. It had to be somebody evil. As part of the investigation, detectives reviewed details related to Jodine's murder. They knew that Art and Lois arrived at Jodine's condo on Swallow Lane sometime after 10 p.m. on February 14, 2007. When Art walked into Jodine's bedroom, investigators knew that her murderer was performing necrophilia. This is an abnormal psychological tendency to have sexual relations with corpses, and it's a well-recognized psychological disorder of disturbed individuals. When investigators interviewed Art and Lois, they asked whether the grieving parents had any idea who would want to hurt their daughter. And that's when Art told the investigators something. He had gotten a pretty good look at the suspect. He said he was a man between 5'8" and 6 foot tall, and in his words, he was chubby. Surprisingly, Art said he thought he knew who this person was. Robert Burns. That's the man he thought was on top of his daughter. Robert Burns is a man who suffered from learning and intellectual challenges, and he was a friend of Jodine's. Their paths often crossed at the bus stop and at the cognitive impairment groups that they both attended. Samantha Raymond was a neighbor of Jodine's, and she was questioned by investigators, and she told them she did see a man running down an embankment near the apartment on the night Jodine was murdered. Although Samantha was able to see the man's face, he was running way too fast for her to get a clear view of distinctive features. The investigators decided they had to locate Robert Burns and talk to him to uncover the truth. They located Robert Burns' house and they placed it under surveillance until they caught him entering or leaving. And one day, while Robert was coming out of his house, police officers approached him and asked him to return with them to the police station for questioning. At the station, Robert Burns told investigators he had nothing to do with Jodine's murder. He gave them a full account of his entire day and said he was never near Jodine's condo at the time. Following up on this alibi, investigators do discover footage of him on a bus when they believe that Jodine was killed. He was not in the area, so they no longer considered him a suspect after the CCTV footage of him was confirmed as part of his alibi. Additionally, he did submit a DNA sample, and it did not match that of the suspect's DNA. The investigators concluded that Jodine asked the person inside of her condo based on those pair of sneakers they discovered near the front door. Additionally, they found evidence that a meal was shared between two people in Jodine's kitchen. So they're thinking, this is Valentine's Day. Clearly she had somebody over. Might have been a date. They shared a dinner. Might have been a romantic meal. They also found signs that Jodine spent a considerable amount of time in her living room with whoever this guest was. An artist with the Carlsbad Police Department sketched a depiction of a man that Art Serrin saw on top of his daughter. And the sketch artist created this drawing based on what Art could remember, and they released this image to the public. They hoped that someone would recognize something about the suspect and contact them for more information. They received hundreds of tips, but when they followed up on them, they failed to find any additional evidence. As the investigation into Jodine's murder progressed, DNA samples were collected from residents throughout the entire community. More than 60 of her neighbors willingly provided DNA samples for consideration, and those DNA samples were swabs that were sent to a private lab for testing, but no match was found. And despite investigators' best efforts, Jodine's investigation stalled, and the public was outraged. Jodine's murder received widespread media coverage in San Diego and beyond, and everyone was upset that this killer was still on the loose. And as a result, Jodine's murder became infamous and forever associated with Valentine's Day in San Diego County. Every year, for years to come, Jodine's murder made headlines every year on February 14th in the San Diego newspapers. They would also run an article in memory of Jodine, honoring her life and asking for help finding her killer. Jodine's father expressed his anger and his frustration and the desire for revenge in his statements to the press. The Baltimore Sun interviewed Lois on the 8th anniversary of Jodine's murder. She said she feared that whoever murdered her daughter would hurt somebody else's daughter. And she expressed other fears and told the Baltimore Sun, "This is 8 years now, and you'd think that somebody would have said something. This monster could be dead, and we will never know." On that 8th anniversary of their daughter's murder, Art and Lois Serrin were 85 and 80 years old. And despite their age, her parents fought hard for justice, and they continued their efforts by talking to the media and still creating flyers trying to ask for more information. They kept in constant contact with police officers in the years following the brutal murder of their daughter. Every week, every single week, Jodine's father talked to investigators. He was trying to make sure they were doing everything they could to solve her murder. To investigators on Jodine's case, it was important to let her family know they had not given up on her. They were working hard to bring her justice. But 10 years went by. 10 years after Jodine was murdered. Detectives in San Diego County attended a conference, and there was a new groundbreaking DNA technology they learned about, Parabon Nano Labs, and their cutting-edge phenotyping technology. This lab was based in Reston, Virginia, and they developed nano-pharmaceuticals and provided DNA phenotyping services to law enforcement agencies. Every individual exhibits a wide variety of physical characteristics that are based on their DNA blueprint. Even though I straighten my hair, in my DNA, it's curly. Even though I wear contacts, for blue eyes, my DNA says I have hazel. From the color and the texture of our hair to the color of our skin and eyes, those are part of our DNA blueprint. An individual's DNA can be reverse engineered into a physical profile by determining how genetic information relates to their appearance. And with this new technology, thousands of genotypes are read from DNA samples to predict the appearance of an unknown individual. With forensic DNA phenotyping, anyone of any ethnicity, including those of mixed ancestries, can determine their genetic background, eye color, hair color, skin color, freckles, face shape, and the list goes on. DNA phenotyping can help identify an individual even if no other databases can. Investigators working on Jodine's murder case in Carlsbad felt that this new DNA technology could assist them in finding their suspect. So they sent the suspect's DNA to Parabon Nanolabs in order to determine his physical characteristics. I had never heard about this or seen this type of DNA profiling done, so it was very interesting to me. The investigators knew that Jodine's murderer was a fair-skinned, blonde-haired, light-eyed individual that was 6 foot tall and a heavy build. Parabon Nanolabs also traced his heritage: Northern Belgium, British, German, Irish, and Scottish descent. While the investigators collected detailed information about their suspect, it wasn't enough to identify him. They were at a crossroads. So they decided to enlist the help of forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick, who used different DNA analysis methods. Dr. Fitzpatrick is an internationally renowned forensic genealogist, a pioneer in the field of genetic genealogy, which I've talked about in a couple videos. And if you want a full rundown of that, I will link one below in the description box and at the end of the video. She has made significant contributions to this area of expertise and study. In 2017, Dr. Fitzpatrick co-founded the DNA Doe Project. This is to reunite unidentified deceased individuals with their families. The method of DNA testing developed by Dr. Fitzpatrick utilizes the male or the YSTR side of DNA. She entered the suspect's DNA using proprietary software and compared it to other DNA samples looking for matches. And after that, she would get a list of last names linked to the suspected DNA. And this is from a genetic genealogy database. Dr. Fitzpatrick's work with Rapid City, South Dakota police helped solve the 1968 murder of Gwen Miller. With the help of Dr. Fitzpatrick's Y-DNA methodology, she was able to narrow the list of suspects to 7 men with the same last name. The last name was Field. Officers from the local police department then identified Eugene Field as their primary suspect in Gwen Miller's murder using old-school investigator techniques. But unfortunately, at the time, the team discovered that Eugene Field was unable to be brought to justice due to his death from cancer in 2009. So now back to Jodine's case. With this proprietary DNA database, Dr. Fitzpatrick assisted Carlsbad investigators in finding the killer of Jodine Serrin. She submitted the suspect's DNA, and several last names connected to the suspect's DNA were returned to investigators. However, investigators placed several men named by Dr. Fitzpatrick at the bottom of their priority list. Those investigating the case knew their suspect was Northern European, and any names that sounded Mediterranean or similar were not their main concern. Even with Dr. Fitzpatrick's assistance, Carlsbad investigators could not find Jodine's murderer. However, in 2018, the solving of decades-old cases using groundbreaking DNA technology would not only provide hope to investigators working on Jodine's murder, but also to cold case investigators worldwide. It was, of course, we've talked about this before if you've been here, the case of the Golden State Killer. Barbara Ray Venter, who assisted investigators in identifying Joseph James D'Angelo, was sought out by the law enforcement departments throughout the country after news broke of his arrest. An investigative agency she caught the attention of was the Carlsbad Police Department. They believed that Barbara Ray Venter could be the one to find Jodine Serrin's murderer. Investigators from Carlsbad contacted Barbara, and they wanted her advice on Jodine's case, and they asked for her assistance. After they had exhausted all other search methods, they still failed to find the 39-year-old's killer. Barbara Ray Venter agreed to assist in Jodine's case. She finally uploaded the suspect's DNA collected by investigators from that scene in 2007 into GEDmatch, which is a public DNA database. Prior to Barbara Ray Venter's assistance with Jodine's investigation, Carlsbad officers didn't have a person of interest. They were at a complete loss. But after her help, investigators had more than that. Now it looked like they had identified the person most likely responsible for Jodine's murder. She gave them a name: David Mabrito. The Carlsbad Police Department launched an investigation into David Mabrito immediately. They learned that David Aaron Mabrito was born in San Antonio, Texas on January 20th, 1969. Eventually, his family relocated to California. David graduated from Mount Carmel High School in San Diego in 1987, and in 1995, he met his future wife, Marisa, and their wedding took place in Vista, California 7 years later. When Marisa Mabrino and David Mabrino got married, she was in the banking industry, and he was a tile installer. Marisa gave birth to their only son, Dylan, in 2000, just 2 years before they were married. On January 30th, 2011, much to the shock of his friends and family, David Mabrito took his own life. In reviewing David's medical examiner's report, investigators found that he had overdosed on drugs. Further investigation revealed that David's wife and son were on vacation when this occurred. On Legacy.com, David's obituary described him as someone who was vibrant and improved the lives of his friends and family. Yet, the investigators also found that he had difficulty maintaining a job due to his meth addiction and his transient lifestyle. After investigating David's background, investigators learned that his relatives lived in Carlsbad, not far from Jodine's house. David was known to law enforcement as a drifter. He often surfed at the beach and battled many demons, but investigators couldn't obtain his DNA for comparison since he was deceased. So Dylan, his son, was their only option. At this point, there was no doubt in Carlsbad investigators' minds that this teenager's life and that of his mother's would be turned upside down with this news. While they visited Dylan and Marisa, they brought a mountain of evidence and documents from Jodine's murder investigation. They wanted to prove that they had all of this evidence to follow up with before turning their lives upside down. Marisa welcomed the Carlsbad investigators and agreed to talk to them. They informed her of the unfortunate reason that they were at her house that day. And without hesitation, Dylan voluntarily gave his DNA to assist the investigators in any way that he could. Then the investigators showed Marisa a picture of the tennis shoes that Jodine's killer left at her door. Investigators had found DNA on those sneakers that matched what was found on Jodine's body. They confirmed that those shoes did belong to her killer, and when Marisa viewed the photo of the sneakers, she turned white as a ghost. She had a visible reaction, and that's when she confirmed that those shoes belonged to her late husband, David. I can't even imagine that moment. Here you are with this person, married to this person, and then you find this out. Besides providing Carlsbad investigators with confirmation that the sneakers were David's, his wife provided another very interesting piece of information. Shortly before his death, officers from the Oceanside Police Department, a neighborhood north of Carlsbad, pulled David over on a traffic stop. They explained to him they stopped him because he matched a description of a suspect in a robbery. Even though it was rare for an officer to take a DNA swab at a traffic stop, the officers asked David if he would be willing to submit his DNA for testing. There was no connection between that robbery in Oceanside and David. However, since David was not a felon, his DNA sample was never submitted to CODIS. But immediately alarm bells start ringing in investigators' minds. They knew that DNA would definitely prove if David was the one who murdered Jodine Serrin on Valentine's Day 2007. They immediately contacted Oceanside authorities to inquire if that DNA sample taken during the traffic stop so many years ago was still available, and it was. As soon as the detectives received David's DNA sample, they rushed it to the lab, and investigators from the Carlsbad Police Department were hopeful that they'd finally be able to provide answers to Art and Lois after 11 long years of unanswered questions. Based on the DNA comparison of the crime scene and David Mabrito, there was a 1 in 64 quadrillion chance of a false positive result. That means there are 18 zeros in that number. I think it's safe to say they found the right person. After working tirelessly on Jodine's case, investigators felt confident, beyond confident, that they could tell Art and Lois who killed their daughter. It took Jodine's parents a few days to get over the news that Jodine's murderer had a name, but that he was dead and wouldn't face justice for his crimes. This is the third case I've done with this same outcome. Art and Lois's first reaction after hearing how investigators found Jodine's murderer was to ask how his son Dylan was. Their concern for David's family when they learned he had brutally murdered their daughter was how selfless they really were. It shocked David's wife that her late husband, the father of her child, committed this crime. However, she felt a strange sense of relief after finding out he was a murderer. Before learning the truth about her husband, she had been haunted by guilt that he had taken his life. She thought that she contributed to that choice. She imagined there must have been something she did that caused her husband to do this, and that maybe she could have saved her husband's life. But in light of what she now knew, she realized that David's death had nothing to do with her. Dylan and Marisa Mabrito exhibited an exceptional willingness to assist these investigators, which stood out to them. They were stunned by this mother and son's courage after finding out what their family member had done. Marisa and Dylan hoped to meet and apologize to Art and Lois, and to be a part of their lives in some way in the future. In an utterly awful and morbid way, David connected all four of them because they were all victims. Investigators hadn't looked into David Mabrito's name when it appeared on Dr. Fitzpatrick's list because it was on there, believe it or not. And that's because there had been a previous adoption in his family. So despite David's last name being of Mediterranean origin, his background was still Northern European. 1 year before David's identification, he was moved to the bottom of the non-priority list. Names can change, but DNA can't. And investigators concluded that David Mabrito killed Jodine in a meth-fueled stupor, and he acted out some of the most horrific sexual fantasies he had. They were unable to determine whether he planned this murder, though, or whether it was spontaneous. That was something investigators would never know. In addition, it was unclear how or when David crossed paths with Jodine, how long they had even known each other if they did. District Attorney Summer Stefan presented Dylan, Marisa, and several other people with this award for displaying extreme bravery in frightening circumstances. In response to a question regarding why they were willing to help the Carlsbad investigators, Dylan and his mom stated that they knew it was the right thing to do. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick commented on the success of genetic genealogy in Jodine's case. She stressed how important it is, since it was the first major advancement in DNA technology since CODIS was established in the 1990s. The esteemed forensic genetic genealogist called it a valuable tool that helps solve many cases right out the gate. Investigators who worked on Jodine's case were blown away by this revolutionary DNA technique. They said they were excited to see the potential it had to close so many other cases and help grieving families. Jodine's picture hangs in Lois Serrin's living room near her front door, so she can talk to her every time she comes and goes. Lois feels happy that despite her short life, Jodine spent time with people that she loved and that loved her, doing the things she enjoyed most. Lois said, "Her beloved daughter, Jodine, taught us all with her special challenges, perseverance, and love of nature. There was joy in her laughter, love in her heart, and faith in her soul. I hope that Jodine Serrin will forever be remembered as the sweet soul that everyone knew she was." I'm so very sorry to Jodine's family that they had to witness what they did and that they had to wait so long to find out who did this, and that really justice could never be served because that person decided to take their own life. These cases are so interesting, although horrifying and heartbreaking. I encourage all of us, even myself, I haven't done it yet, to submit our DNA to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA so that maybe, I know it's not something we want, but maybe we can help bring justice to someone out there if someone connected to us has done anything like this to someone like Jodine. Thank you all so much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Bye.